When a detective tackles a perplexing serial killer case, he seeks aid from an old friend who is a psychic. Yet the stakes skyrocket when they discover the killer possesses enhanced psychic abilities, foreseeing their every move. Can they outsmart this mastermind? Let's all find out. Hey guys, welcome back to IM Movies. Today we'll be looking at the 2015 American crime mystery movie titled Solace. But before we jump into the details, make sure to show us some love by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now let's get right into it. FBI agents Joe and his team arrive at the home of a recently murdered man who was found murdered while relaxing in his home. Upon investigating, they discover that the murder was executed in a manner identical to previous killings, indicating it was committed by the same person. The murders are characterized by a distinctive method of puncturing the base of the victim's skulls with a 5-inch instrument, targeting the connection between the brainstem and the spinal cord. They call it medulla oblongata. This leaves them curious about the motive behind the murderer's choice of this particular method. Frustrated by the string of murders and his failure to apprehend the culprit, Joe decides to seek assistance from his longtime psychic friend John. Despite Catherine's reservations about involving an outsider in such a complex case, Joe is determined to proceed. He assures her that John has aided in solving previous criminal cases. The next day, Joe and Catherine set out to see John. On their way, Joe reveals that John was devastated after his daughter died of leukemia 2 years ago, and his inability to manage his pain destroyed his marriage. He also gave up his medical practice and retreated to the countryside to live a solitary life. When Joe and Catherine arrive at John's house, Joe shares his reason for visiting, but John is reluctant to embark on any adventures, preferring his solitary existence. Shortly after, Catherine interrupts to inform Joe of an emergency call, and Joe introduces Catherine to John. Catherine leaves the case files with John, urging him to consider their request, and pats him on the shoulder before leaving. Upon her touch, Joe experiences a vision of Catherine with a gunshot wound to her head and blood streaming down her face. After they leave, John plays an opera record that triggers memories of his daughter's vibrant life and her agonizing final moments. He then decides to take a look at the case file. While perusing the file, he stumbles upon a note left by the killer. The coincidence that the words match the lyrics of the music he's listening to at that moment strikes him, prompting him to hurry outside. There, he has a vision of a strange man whom he perceives to be the killer, driven by a mission that can only be stopped if he's dead. This revelation prompts a change of heart, and John resolves to help his friends solve the case and apprehend the serial killer. The following day, John arrives in the city and is picked up by Joe and Catherine. Later, they brief John about the murder cases, including his approach and consistency in leaving no traces. Later, they visit the home of the serial killer's first victim, where John learns how she was murdered. As Joe steps away to take a call from his wife, John asks Catherine for her interpretation of the note left by the killer. She explains that it's a classic riddle, reciting a line that matches what John saw earlier. Catherine suggests that the killer might be mockingly seeking permission to reveal himself without actually intending to do so. Afterward, Catherine heads home, while Joe and John go out for dinner. During their meal, John shares a joke that leaves them both smiling. Joe mentions how John's smile was once a reason why Elizabeth, John's wife, fell in love with him. As Joe playfully taps John on the shoulder, John experiences a troubling vision of Joe in a hospital bed, but he keeps it to himself. While driving home, Joe asks John if he sees anything, hoping to close the case as soon as possible. However, John responds that he doesn't see anything significant. Later that night, as Joe heads to his hotel room, he experiences flashbacks of his daughter in pain at the hospital. He also has visions of a shadowy cross, a train station, and the word Atticus. Additionally, he sees visions of Catherine with a gunshot wound to her head. Later that night, John is awakened by a call from Joe regarding another murder case. At the crime scene, they discover a note left by the killer with the time 4:16. Coincidentally, the exact time they arrived. The victim is found in a bathtub, murdered in the same style as the previous victims. When Joe touches the victim, he has a vision of her returning home to a romantic setting, thinking her husband had prepared it for her. As she relaxes in the tub, the killer pierces her from behind. John warns them not to touch the water, though he hasn't yet figured out why. However, one of the agents announces they have a suspect named David Raymond, who happens to be the woman's husband. He's taken in for questioning, where they inform him of his wife's death, which comes as a shock. David inquires if his wife left him a letter believing she committed suicide. Catherine questions his assumption, and he reveals he left her a letter before hastily leaving the house the previous night. When asked why he was leaving hastily, he revealed that he was leaving her for another woman. Meanwhile, John, who's already gotten a vision of David, knows he isn't telling the whole truth and asks to speak with him. He reveals to David that he was leaving his wife for a man, not a woman as he claims, and that he had contracted HIV, leaving him shocked. After the interrogation, Joe informs John that a test confirms that David's deceased wife also contracted HIV. Joe realizes the reason John warned them not to touch the water. Later, Joe invites John to have breakfast at his home. While serving them breakfast, Joe's wife Laura reveals that she's still in touch with John's wife Elizabeth, and confesses that she still loves him. Returning to the murder case, John notes the consistency that all victims were terminally ill, concluding that the killer only targets people with terminal illnesses. However, Joe refutes his theory, pointing out that the little boy who was killed was healthy with no medical records. John suggests they go talk to his parents. As he has an appointment, Joe suggests Catherine accompany him. On their way to the boy's family, Catherine wonders if John possesses mystical or religious powers. John explains that he simply has a heightened form of human intuition. Catherine then asks if he can see anything about her at that moment, but John replies that he isn't seeing anything. Upon arriving at the deceased boy's home, they meet his distraught father. Catherine suggests they may have discovered why his son was murdered, and inquires if the boy was healthy before his death. The father confirms that his son was perfectly healthy before his death. Shortly after, the mother joins them, and Catherine explains the need to conduct an autopsy to determine if the boy had any underlying illnesses, which would aid their investigation. However, as Christian scientists who don't believe in conventional medicine, they adamantly refuse, citing their belief that their son's death was God's will. However, John shares the story of his daughter's death, explaining his belief that medicine cannot change God's plan. He convinces them that conducting the autopsy will aid in solving the murder mysteries and prevent further innocent deaths. Reluctantly, they agree to allow the examination of their son's body. During the autopsy at the lab, John receives a fax from the killer, directing him to check the child's cerebellar lobe. As the doctor examines the boy's brain, he discovers a pea-sized tumor, confirming John's suspicion that the killer targets terminally ill individuals. Immediately after this revelation, John abruptly leaves the lab without saying a word. Concerned, Joe follows him, eager to understand why he left in such a manner. John reveals that the killer is like him. He can see the future and is likely leading them into a trap. This realization prompts him to consider walking away from the case. Later that night, while packing his bags, Catherine visits John, expressing her frustration over his decision to abandon the case when they're so close to solving it. John reveals his doubts about catching the killer, considering the murderer's cunning methods and the fact that he targets terminally ill individuals who are already destined to die. Catherine insists that it's still murder. Catherine asks him if he would say the same thing if it were to be his daughter, prompting John to ponder silently. Believing John is keeping details to himself, Catherine presses him to reveal what he knows about the case. Instead, John opens up about Catherine's past, revealing that she had a baby and gave it up for adoption, which she regrets. He shares more intimate details that bring her to tears. Catherine urges him to share more about her future, but John asks her to go home, refusing to disclose his vision of her being shot. Later that night, they receive intel on the killer's location. Joe and his team raid the location, only to discover a gruesome scene where the victim's body parts have been dismembered and used to create macabre art. This disturbing murder leaves Joe confused and frustrated, unsure if they are dealing with the same killer or different perpetrators. Meanwhile, John is on his way out of town, seated on the bus, when he experiences his usual visions. This time he sees flowers, frogs, and choristers singing on a podium. Luckily, Joe catches up with him and pleads for John's help in finding and stopping the killer. John agrees to return and assist them. On their way back, Joe reveals that they found traces of snail poison in the flowers that were in the last victim's bathwater. There's only one place the flower could have come from. Joe takes John to the flower field, and upon touching the plucked flower, John sees a garbage can in the middle of the field. The officers search the garbage can and find the bottom part of the dress that was hanging on the wall at the gruesome murder scene. Using a police dog, they trace the scent to a suspect's location. John senses impending danger, but still follows the dog's lead alongside Joe and his team. Upon arrival, they find a young man holding a mug with frogs drawn on it, matching John's visions. Suddenly, the young man shoots Joe and escapes through the window. John urges them to call an ambulance, and he and Catherine chase after the young man, who had just shot a cab driver and hijacked his car. Despite his attempts to evade them, they manage to catch up with him with the help of John's psychic powers. However, during the chase, they get into a car crash. Crawling out of the wreck, John gets a vision that the young man will kill him if he crawls out of the vehicle and stands up, so he stays low, allowing Catherine to shoot Linus. However, they realize that he's not their main suspect, as he couldn't envision his death, causing Catherine to scream out of frustration. John visits Joe at the hospital, where he looks frail. It turns out that Joe is at a critical stage of his cancer and won't live much longer, which John has seen in his visions but kept to himself as he didn't want to upset it by talking about it. Joe tells John to always check on his family after he's gone, and implores him to make up with his wife. In a sad turn of events, Joe eventually succumbs to his cancer, leaving his family, friends, and colleagues devastated. During his funeral, John gives Joe's son a comforting hug and gets a vision of the bright future ahead of him, which brings him some solace. One night, while drinking at the bar, the killer reveals himself to John, explaining that he doesn't take pleasure in his actions. He shares that he sees the people he kills experiencing agonizing pain due to terminal illnesses in the future, and hearing their pleas for relief prompts him to end their suffering mercifully. Furthermore, the killer admits to orchestrating Joe's shooting to spare him from prolonged agony, as he had many days of suffering ahead due to his illness. He expresses that the greatest acts of love are often the hardest to commit. While the killer speaks, John envisions alerting the officers at the bar, but the killer has already foreseen the outcome. John then strikes him with a glass. The killer quickly alerts the officers that John is armed, leading them to restrain John and allowing the killer to escape. In the aftermath of the bar incident, Catherine and her team identify the killer from a composite sketch based on the waitress's description, yet his full identity remains unknown. Catherine urges her colleagues to conduct further investigation. Meanwhile, John walks the streets in pursuit of the killer. Despite experiencing distracting waves of visions concerning the strangers on his path, he manages to identify the killer's location and discovers he's already carrying out his next mission. Soon after, we see a man enter his apartment to find champagne and a congratulatory note. He opens the drink and begins to consume it. John arrives at the house of the killer's next potential victim to stop his plan. The homeowner is startled to find two strangers in his living room, and the killer instructs him to sit down. The killer justifies his actions, but John tells him he can't play God. Realizing John won't allow him to proceed with his plans, the killer retreats and escapes. John warns the homeowner that he's been poisoned and advises him to call an ambulance before pursuing the killer. Catherine and her team finally uncover the killer's full identity and raid his residence. However, he had foreseen their arrival and left behind a message for Catherine, appearing as if he were present and speaking to her directly. He claims he's not a psychopath and is doing the victims a favor by ending their lives painlessly, sparing them the agony they would have endured in the future. Meanwhile, John traces the killer through the streets until they reach a train station. As he approaches, John's vision becomes clearer, revealing details he had seen before. The killer boards the train and John quickly follows suit. Once John boards the train, the killer fires a gun in the air, causing the passengers to scamper off in panic, leaving him and John alone. Meanwhile, Catherine and her team receive a report on the killer's location. Despite instructions to stand down, Catherine rushes to the train station, unwilling to back out. On the train, the killer claims he and John are alike, but John disagrees to this, stating he's not a killer. However, the killer reveals he's ill and wants John to end his impending agony by killing him. As they reach the next station, John sees a sign reading Atticus, which he's been seeing in his vision. He then gets a clearer vision of Catherine being shot by the killer. As Catherine arrives on the train, the killer shoots at her, but John pushes her aside, taking the bullet intended for her. He then returns fire, killing him. Fortunately, Catherine is unharmed, while John sustains a non-life-threatening injury. John undergoes successful surgery to remove the bullet lodged in his head. Upon his release, he reunites with his wife, prompting memories of his daughter's final moments. It is revealed that John's devastation wasn't merely from his daughter's death, but also from witnessing her suffering and being forced to kill her to end her pain quickly, revealing the deep truth to the killer's assertion that the greatest acts of love are often the hardest to commit. And this is where our story ends. If you'd like to see us recap any other movies or topics you have in mind, just drop a comment and let us know. And don't forget to hit the like button, share this recap, and subscribe to stay updated for the next one. Until next time.